Welcome to Lecture 2 for ED 603. The readings for this unit is our Chapter 2 in our textbook on data, methods, and tools, and there's enough material in here to teach a whole course on. I'm going to just recap some of the highlighted topics that you should really pay attention to. Please read through this outline, and if you have any questions, feel free to make questions in the forums or email me, and I will be happy to address them with you. I actually really enjoy these topics, and I think I can help you understand them quite easily. So if you're having trouble, feel free to ask. But I'm not going to read these slides to you because there's so much information. One question posed at the outset of the chapter is, why is there a science of personality? And some of the reasons for that are explained in the chapter in more detail, but basically using science to understand personality can help us make sense of the various perspectives that are out there about different ideas about psychology and personality, and try to come to some idea of what the truth is or what's right so we can help people. We can also use science to help make accurate testable predictions about how things develop and how things work, interventions, for example, to help people. And also to try to figure out what's valid or true in the speculations and theories that are postulated about personality so that we can use those to better people's situation in their lives. The chapter describes a wide range of measures that can be used to assess personality, and in assessing it, help understand it better. So I'll let you read through these. The next few slides outline several of them. I'll just interject a comment on this slide. I find projective measures quite interesting and do think there's some use for them, but in context of an evaluation. I would never, based on my training, use a projective in and of itself to label someone or put them in a category in terms of their personality. Projectives, as noted here, are ambiguous test stimuli that you present to people, and they respond to those, and you can interpret what their answers mean. There can be some science behind this. Some people think it's just, people making up answers and interpreting it out of the blue. But you actually can norm a projective measure. You can give someone an ambiguous stimuli and see what's the normal response people give. And then you can compare future responses to that and say, this kid gave a response that no one out of the other million people tested gave. That's unusual. So you can actually use science to assess the results of these, but there is some controversy about how valid some of them are or aren't. I made comment about this because when I was in undergraduate school, I had a friend who was studying to be a school psychologist, and my first introduction to doing these tests was with her because she had to give tests as part of her learning, and she had us do a test called the Draw a Person test, which is basically you draw a person, and I'll share a personal embarrassing story here. I drew this woman sitting, looking and waiting for a date, not realizing what she was getting it at. And it was just kind of interesting because when she got done, I was like, oh, geez, she's going to have a heyday interpreting this one. But basically, you look for themes in people's drawings. So again, I wouldn't ever use a projective individually for an evaluation, but you could give multiple measures, and if you see a theme, if for example every projective response has violence in it, or every projective response deals with relationships with a parent or something, you might suspect there's something about that going on with the person, and then you could assess further to get valid conclusions about what's going on or what they need or how you might help them. I think this slide warrants some commenting too. There are lots of ways to physiologically to measure what's happening physiologically that relates to personality. And I mentioned this slide because in ED 601 we talk about technological advances and how that's affected development and research related to development. And that applies to personality and self-esteem as well. The technology has increased so much how we're able to see how the brain works and how neuropsychology is really working. These methods here are all relatively recent developments in ways to measure underlying causes of behavior and traits. So it's just interesting to note how much we've learned so rapidly given the technology we now have to image or measure physiological responses in people accurately. And it clearly illustrates too, the research does, that there's a strong connection between our biology and our behavior and personality, if you will. And also that has influenced the interventions. You can see on TV every day ads for medications and so forth, and the understanding of mental health disorders, that they're not all just, quote, in your head, end quote. There's a lot of biology behind them as well, and that's important to consider, that nature and nurture influence how we are and how our personality presents itself. This slide illustrates, just how important it is to define well what you're measuring. And in personality, which in and of itself can be difficult to define, the little subtraits that you're looking at as a researcher, or that researchers are looking at, are important to define clearly, so that when you as consumers of the research read it, you know what the researcher really did and what they were looking at, and then you can decide if that applies to your work or your students and so forth. If you take action research as an MED student and do an action research project, one of the requirements is that you very clearly operationalize or define your variables. That also helps people replicate your study. If they know what you measured and how you measured it, they can do the things the same way, or they can tweak your results and your study, and adjust it to find maybe more accurate findings, because as research progresses, obviously you want it to get more and more accurate and teach us more and more about the construct that's being studied. The book does a detailed and nice job explaining what correlation is all about, and basically it's looking at how variables relate to one another. At this level of text, they're usually talking about a linear relationship, or relationships between variables, if you plot them, tend to form a plot somewhere between a straight line going up at a 45-degree angle, or down, or with no relationship, which would be a zero correlation. I'm going to let you read this for yourselves. I'm assuming you've had some basic stats. You might not have. If you have any questions at all, I love to talk about this and would be happy to help you. But just look at the next few slides and make sure they make sense to you, and basically understand that correlation is looking at, as one variable changes, how does the other one change in relation to it. So a very clear, simple example is a positive correlation would generally exist between height and weight. The taller you are, the more you tend to weigh. Of course, some people don't fit into that exact pattern. Some short people are very heavy and some tall people are very slender. But overall, the plot would be an upward cluster going up to form kind of a line going upwards from the low to high. And higher weights would be associated with higher heights, lower weights would be associated with lower heights, and so forth. So make sure that is understandable to you, and let me know if it's not. Correlations are fairly simple to calculate, so it's often a tool that's used in research, but this slide makes the point too that you need to be careful not to assume that correlation means variables cause each other. So just keep that in mind. Things can be related, but there could be a third variable influencing them both that is actually making the relationship that you see happen. It may not be that X causes Y. Z could be influencing one or both of X and Y and interfere with your interpretation. So just be careful with that, and don't assume that because two variables are correlated that they cause each other. This slide notes that to be useful, we should make our observations and studies on constructs that are well defined, and our measurements should be reliable to yield valid results. Valid basically means accurate, and you cannot have accuracy if you don't have reliability. Some variables aren't reliable, like the weather, for example, but in research, when you're operationally defining your variables, you really need to have reliable measures to have valid conclusions. If you don't, you don't. And they used to say to us at Penn State, garbage in, garbage out. If you have bad data, there's no point doing your study, because you're going to have bad results that don't mean anything. So just keep that in mind. The text defines different types of reliability, because you can look at it across time, or within the measure you're giving, or across raters, and that's important to consider the different types. A good measure should really meet the criteria for reliability on all these aspects. And then the next slide talks about types of validity. Just be familiar with those terms. As noted, there's a lot of material in this lecture and the readings for this unit. If you want to get beyond just how are things related and look at what actually does cause what, you would have to do a true experiment, and that can be very difficult to do in the social sciences because there are so many confounding variables, as we just mentioned with correlation, that impact the relationship between variables you might be able to manipulate and look at in your study. Just be familiar with these terms. Again, you'll need to know them if you take action research, but they're important to understand as a consumer of research too. The independent variable is what the experimenter manipulates, and they're looking to see the effect of it on the dependent variable. One way I remember this is just that the dependent variable depends on what level of the independent variable the subject got. In a true experiment, you would have groups. One would get the treatment condition, and one would be a control group that is not subjected to the treatment. So make sure you're familiar with these terms and understand that a true experiment would show causality, whereas a correlational study would not. Our text reviews the very important point that when you're looking at personality variables and trying to study them, you're using human subjects, and it's very important that you follow ethical procedures. The book talks about reasons for that and some of the legal and educational ramifications of that. For example, having to make proposals to institutional review boards and so forth before you study variables that are related to people's personality that could hurt them, obviously. So it's just important to keep in mind that this isn't something you just go out and give people projectives and publish a study about. You need to have approval, and I think you all know this, but it's just important that the research be ethical. There are some past examples of studies that were done before these safeguards were put into place that could have had harmful ramifications for the participants. So that's been part of the impetus to develop these ethical standards that, for example, the American Psychological Association has for the research that people do in these fields. And finally, I'd like you to just think about how do these readings impact your practice as a teacher, parent, or adult in a relationship. I want this course to be useful to you as well as informative. So I know you just read through a whole ton of information, but how does this affect your work and your life? So here's a prompt for you just to think about how this could be used as a teacher and how you could apply the information to studying the constructs that impact your work. And one final tip is in chapter 15, Mischel defines self-esteem. Read that because that's going to be an underlying piece of every unit too. We want to know about personality, but also how does it relate to self-esteem in your students. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for bearing with this lecture. It's one of the longer ones, and have a great day.